This is David Diaz, and you're watching the TV Writer Podcast.
Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for scriptwriting information in print and on the web, and by Final Draft scriptwriting software, the entertainment industry standard for scriptwriting worldwide. My name is Gray Jones, and I want to welcome you to the TV Writer Podcast, partner of Script Magazine, episode 36, for Thursday, October 6th, 2011. Well, today I'm so excited to bring you an interview that I had with animation writer, story editor, creative producer David Diaz. Now, the reason I'm so excited on this episode is because Dave is a great friend of mine. We actually went to school together at York University in the early 90s and have kept in touch. Actually, he lives just a few blocks away from me. And so I'm really, really excited to have him on. And he's written on a pile of stuff. I mean, some shows you might recognize, Max and Ruby. He's written on Franklin, Caillou. Actually, let me just read a whole bunch. Berenstain Bears, Blazing Dragons, Sticking Around, Anatoly, Dumb Bunnies, Blasters Universe, Metabots, George and Martha, Beyblade, Roly Poly Oly, George Shrinks, Jacob Tutu, Chili Beach, Cyber Chase, Mischief City. He's written on ones that you might know if you're in Canada, the Doodle Bops, and as well Raspberry Jazzberry Jam, and the Cat in the Hat knows a lot about that. A whole pile of stuff. Magi Nation, Stella and Sam, Scaredy Squirrel, just a pile. And he does work here in Toronto. It is a big industry in Canada. As you might know, there's quite a bit of animation that's done in Canada, in particular in Toronto. And he's got a lot to say about not just Toronto, but the animation field in general, how you might want to break into it, and all the ins and outs. So that's coming up shortly. And a couple of things I do want to mention. One is that you'll notice that this podcast is being released on Thursday, at least for the next 4, 5, 6 months while Chuck is in season. NBC's Chuck, of course, I do a podcast for that at chuckpodcast.com. In order to make the schedules work, I'm going to be shifting the TV Writer Podcast releases to Thursdays. So the Chuck podcast will be released usually on Mondays and the TV Writer podcast on Thursdays. So hopefully that doesn't inconvenience you. There'll still be usually one per week. You can get them, of course, at the tvwriterpodcast.com site. You can get them at blip.tv/TV Writer Podcast. And that actually is the place that you go if you want to see them in the highest resolution. They are a little higher resolution on the blip.tv site. And as well, you can get them on iTunes. Just search for TV Writer Podcast. And there are a lot of helpful resources at tvwriterpodcast.com. Make sure you go check out that site for web resources. There's a lot of web links that you can click and get to a pile of different things, including a massive script database with tons of free scripts. There's also a Twitter database with almost 900 writers on Twitter that you can follow, and lots of other things on the site. One thing I do want to mention is that you may have noticed that Amazon.com released new Kindles in the last week. And I think they're awesome. I know that there's going to be a lot of them under Christmas trees this Christmas. And I do want to remind you that any Amazon purchase, including Kindles and Kindle ebooks, can support the podcast. And I invite you, if you're thinking about buying these as gifts or for yourself in the coming months, that you do go to tvwriterpodcast.com first, click on the store link, and when you go to the store, there's a link that takes you to the Amazon.com site. But as long as you order within that session, every single thing that you order, including Kindles and ebooks, can help the podcast with a little percentage. So please do consider that. As well, you can follow a Canadian link. If you, unfortunately, not all of the Kindles are available in Canada, but some of them are. And any Amazon.ca purchase can also help to support the podcast. And I ask that you please consider doing that because we definitely do need your help. But right now, we are moving on to my interview with animation writer David Diaz. Enjoy. This is Gray, and I'm here with animation writer, story editor, creative producer, and good friend David Diaz. How you doing, Dave?
I'm good, Greg. Good to talk to you.
Yeah, and of course, I'll I'll have mentioned it in the introduction, but we go way, way back to York University and lots in between. And it's great to actually have a friend of mine on the podcast. Actually, you live a couple blocks away from me, so that's pretty cool too.
Yeah, 5 minutes away, I think, actually. So this is like the longest connection. I think this Skype is going through miles and miles of cable. Meanwhile, I could just walk over there and shout in your window, I think.
Yeah. So anyway, so I'm really grateful you could be on the podcast. We've had a few animated writers talking, and some have talked about the sort of the bigger shows like the Cleveland show and shows like that. One writer for Family Guy was on, and then Stephen Darren-Sett
Yes.
was on as well. But I know you had mentioned when you were on the TV Writer Chat a few weeks ago that that animation represents, what did you say, something like 20 or 19% of the Writers Guild?
And the Writers Guild in Canada specifically, it was about 18% of all the productions that writers got paid for under the Writers Guild banner were animation, which was actually a pretty big number. I thought it would be somewhere maybe closer to 10, 12, 15%, but it's provided a lot of work up here. I think it's probably the nature of the co-productions that Canada is just a hotspot.
Well, I'd be curious to know what the percentage is in the States, but I know it's not that small. I mean, say it's 1 out of every 5 writers in Canada. Even if it was 1 out of every 10 writers in the States, I don't think that we see 10% of the screenwriting resources for animation. And so that's why I'm really glad to have you on and have other animation writers on the podcast so that we can learn about this area that obviously there's a lot of work there.
There is. In fact, it's become just I think it's probably best described as a stable part of the industry in terms of that there's just the amount of productions that are going on has been pretty level over the last like 15 years since I've been 13 years, I think, has been how long I've been writing. But there's been a pretty high number of production that's been pretty consistent. You know, drama has flagged up here for a period of time, and sitcoms were almost non-existent for a period of time. But animation has remained pretty steady as a whole, as a percentage of the work.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I think that adults go through more trends, perhaps. Like we might be into dramas for a while, then we're into reality for a while. But kids always want animation. Yeah,
that's pretty much a given. Now I have a almost 3-year-old myself, and it's a staple. I think it's, you know, there's just something universal about it, and if it's done properly, adults enjoy it as well. Like there's genres that are dedicated strictly towards adult viewing, but there's a gigantic range of shows that sort of fall anywhere from like preschool all the way up to teens and then into the adult genres. So there's something very universal in that anybody can turn on and find some cartoon that suits their taste and their leanings.
Yeah, well, and the interesting thing that I find is, I know when we were growing up, there was Saturday morning cartoons, which were all for kids, yeah. And there were sort of the afternoon, just after school kind of cartoons, which were maybe into the early teens, like Transformers. Yeah. But there wasn't a lot of animation all day long, and there wasn't a lot of animation that was above the sort of preteen level. And now it seems, I mean, you can literally turn on channels that have animation 24/7, and you can turn on channels that have animation that's clearly not for kids.
Oh yeah, well, you know what it is? It's the proliferation of it. I don't claim to be an animation scholar in terms of the history of its development, but having lived, you know, being a kid in the 70s and watching that stuff, it was really, really special when it came on. I mean, everybody has their memories of like watching the Saturday morning cartoons, and then even afternoons. It just seemed like it was more sophisticated because it was, you know, it was built for older kids coming home from school. You know, it really was a big deal. And what happened, I guess, is that with all these proliferation of channels and stuff, is in addition to, you could watch, you know, Cartoon Network and see it all day long, or Disney had a big, huge block, and Nick and all these channels, is that there was just a desire for it. Like, it's ultimately, you don't see that many shows of a genre out there unless people are clamoring for it. And I think as a whole, it's sort of tapered off in terms of like, it's almost reaching a saturation point where it's like, eventually you start seeing enough of a type of show, like a preschool kid show and stuff, and people become a lot more discerning about it, because it's like, okay, another preschool kid show, okay, what's new? Like, what's new for me here to watch in this? You know, which is as it should be, because you shouldn't treat it indiscriminately. Like, I think when you watch the stuff from the 70s, a lot of it doesn't stand up because it was really maligned. It was just people that were working in it really didn't treat it with the respect that it deserved. And so especially the writing side of it is just like, it's hack central, right? When you're watching it. And it's a shame, you know, and actually, I mean, the animation quality is terrible too, because animation was such a painstaking process to do, and TV budgets just didn't accommodate anything good. So you'd get like the really crappy Spider-Man sort of stuff, which has its own charm, but
Yeah.
as a whole, the technique was terrible, But people ate it up because it was just so novel. Like to see cartoons on TV, it was just novel, you know.
Well, that begs the question. I know because I worked at 9 Story at a company that did predominantly animation, and were just starting into live action, and I was working on the live action part of it. But I know that it still takes a lot of people to put together an animated show, and it takes a lot of time to put together an animated show. But at the same time, I know that the technology has to have helped the process. So tell me a little bit about, say, versus Spider-Man days versus now, what that technology shift has brought.
Well, it's funny because I think I can actually speak with some legitimacy, because before I started writing, I was a picture editor. Well, at least assistant picture editor, sort of about as far as I got. But that was my interest stream going through university. I wanted to be a big filmmaker like Lucas, Spielberg, that generation, but I wanted an actual job that paid me something. So I thought I need a skill that I can market, and I got into editing, and I segued into editing, at least in animation, through doing post for a Canadian Film Center feature that was posting at Deluxe downtown Toronto. And there was an editor who worked at Nelvana, the big animation company, and she was assisting on a feature there. And that's how I got the link into Nelvana. And when I first started there, half the show still originated on 35 millimeters.
Wow.
So, they had Steenbecks and flatbeds and that kind of stuff there. And they needed assistance to be able to sync, quote unquote, up the footage, right? Which is a different process than in live action, because it's slates, but it's all, it's based on the mouth movements, all this kind of stuff. So it was literally it's not a hard sync. You're kind of looking it up and it's like, okay, one frame off seems a little weird. It's close enough, because sometimes the animation would be bad and you couldn't tell if it was in sync or not. This would be the closest you could get.
Wow.
But, and then they just didn't have the kind of budget or time to get the kind of reshoots that they needed. So, the first show I ever worked on was Free Willy, the cartoon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, which I think had about 12 episodes on ABC back in this is dating me, back in like 1995.
Yeah.
And it had this big eco theme, which was kind of noble, but the whale talked, right? And whenever he talked, he had this gigantic mouth that was it was actually really distracting to watch, because he'd be talking to this kid and there'd be like, all you could see is this gigantic whale tongue talking. But there'd be some pretty bad animation mistakes, and there's only so much that they could fix, because they're take ones that they'd call them, and then they'd maybe have enough time to call a handful or a dozen reshoots, and it was always the major ones, and that's what they would fix. So as time sort of went on, like, I guess it's all budget, right? If you got enough of a budget, and you can be like The Simpsons and you can get like 1 million reshoots and rewrite the entire script if you need to as you go, to make it funnier, to make it more interesting, then great. But for regular TV animation, this is sort of what you had. It's you maybe get one set of reshoots and that's it. But as more and more stuff went digital, it was just interesting to see the process, because it was like, it would be in-house digital. At least at Nelvana, they would be doing a whole bunch of stuff digitally in-house, and it was fantastic looking animation. But it got to the point where I think it was just prohibitive from a cost perspective. Like, they did ink and paint and all that kind of stuff digitally in-house on some shows, and they just, I wasn't privy to the producing aspect of it, but if the show didn't come back later, you heard rumblings. It's like, wow, it was costing too much, So I think that's sort of, I think when they started doing like a lot of the co-productions things, were because it was like companies, even when you're the size of a Nelvana or whatever, and if some shows are getting too prohibitive, you have to look for other models to do it. And then so you would look around at other countries and say, hey, you like this idea, let's team up, and you take half the budget, I take half the budget, you take half the workload, and we'll do the other half, and that kind of thing. But in terms of the technical side of it, it's just been really, really interesting, because depending on the production, you might farm out all the in-house to somebody else, So even though it's cheaper to do it digitally, you still might have it done in France or in India or Australia or any of the other number of countries. Brazil's another big co-production.
Korea,
yeah. Whatever is the cheapest to get it done, but still have it look fairly decent. I think there's a standard now that people generally have to adhere to, at least in terms of animation quality, for some of the bigger networks and bigger production companies, which is good. You don't get below a certain level of quality, right? Which is, excellent. As a writing perspective, it's good to see stuff look good. Yeah, it's been a very, very interesting to see the transition from film to digital over the years. So
you were editing or assistant editing at Nelvana, which is one of the bigger animation companies in Canada. And so what was the point that you said, I want to write for animation?
I actually got really lucky. They had such a big slate at one point. Like they were really pushing, they were growing at an exponential rate. And they were really pushing more and more deals with some of these networks to get like more series done. And I think the second year I was there, when I was working in post, they got this mammoth deal with CBS to do like 6 half-hour. It was almost like the first instance of a company sort of programming their entire morning block for a network. And so Nelvana all of a sudden has to produce these 6 half-hour series. And so Patrick Loubert, the owner of the company, decided he wanted to have an in-house writing staff. I think over the years they had a number of sort of small writing staffs on a production by production basis, but they just wanted to have a bigger staff. He was really big into the writing part of it. So there was just a call put out. It wasn't even like official. Like it wasn't like posters put on the wall saying, "Hey, you want to be a writer? Come and apply." It was like almost through the grapevine from producers. And I had just started writing 1 or 2 scripts just as an aside. Like I worked on these shows in post and thought, how do these things get written? Like I went to film school. I wanted to write and direct. Who writes this stuff? And I looked through the scripts and I had access to storyboards and stuff all the time. And I had a connection to one of the story editors, and I'd written one script. It got bought. And so that's just that one script got me the interview to be on staff for this junior writing program. And then I got the gig. So there were 4 of us that got hired that first year. And that first year turned into 6 years.
Wow.
Being on staff. Yeah. They just kept growing for a period of time. And then it kind of got tougher. Like they didn't have the same level of productions, and then it got harder and harder. It got to the point where I think Nelvana just finally said, look, we don't need, it's a luxury to have this many writers on staff. No animation company in their right mind generally keeps that many writers on staff. Like there was probably about 10 of us, I think, at one point.
And so let's talk about that a bit, because in scripted television, it's typically almost always written by a writing staff. There's a writing room where you gather around a table and somebody's writing on a whiteboard, and there's an assistant who's typing it up, and you see it on a HDTV or something. Animation is generally not that way. Tell me about how animation usually is written.
You're usually getting 2 writers, essentially, right? You get the head writer or story editor, and then you get the freelance writer. So in some shows, that's literally all you have in terms of a collaboration is 2, right? In terms of brainstorming. And it's strictly a budgetary thing. You know, productions of this nature don't have the kind of money to hire writers on a regular basis to brainstorm in the room. Although some of them do they try to get these sort of writer summits going, where what they'll do is they'll pay writers for their time to be in a room for like a day or 2 days or however many days they afford. And usually some sort of guarantee or that a writer will get a script or 2 out of it, right? Because you don't want writers to like pitch a whole bunch of ideas and say, thanks for your time. And then everybody else takes the ideas and writes them up. It doesn't work that way.
Yeah.
You know? So, but that way they can get the idea of a room and the productivity of a room, but not necessarily have to pay them for an entire season to be there. But at the very minimum, it's always like, you know, a show gets bought, whether it's the creator of the show writes it or another writer comes up with the idea for the show. And then the story editor has to say, okay, how many of these am I going to write myself? Which is usually only a certain number, because schedule wise, there's no way that they'll have time to write all of them themselves. They'll kill themselves. So they have to say, oh, how many are we going to farm out? And how many are we going to farm out? How many writers do we need? Is it the kind of show where writers are going to pitch on it? And if it is, then it's open season. They put out the call to agencies or wherever saying, we need writers to pitch on this show. Who do you have that fits this demographic, this genre of show? And then you get a bunch of writers and they start pitching. You know, if it's a show where it's just like something that's arcing and there's, you know, you're not being productive by hiring freelancers pitching stories that have no idea what's really going on in the show, then maybe they'll hire a few select writers who aren't in a room, but they might have the odd meeting just to get up to speed, you know. But it always boils down to just like the head writer and the freelancer, and they'll communicate however. And so it's like the freelancer will pitch something and the story writer will say, yep, I like that. And then they get it approved and the story's greenlit, and then they get a contract and then they write it. And it's just back and forth. And whether or not this story editor decides like how the note process happens is completely different from production to production, from head writer to head writer. It's sometimes they filter them, you know, if the notes are really bad or whatever it is, then the head writer might just soften it a bit and say, look, we need to take another crack at this. Here's some of the bigger picture issues. Other times it's like, yeah, here's the 5 or 6 sets of notes that completely conflict and are infuriating and may actually offend you personally. Here they are. Have fun, and they can get personal.
Yeah, but I think it's pretty fascinating, and actually because I think the primary audience of the podcast is people who are desiring to break in, or perhaps have broken in and are at the entry level and want to get forward in their career. And in scripted writing, it's mandated by at least the American Writers Guild that each TV show has at least 2 freelance scripts per season. But generally speaking, even though that sounds, that's so promising, usually those 2 freelance scripts are given to somebody who's already working on the show, or a cousin, or, it's somebody that they know, and it's not just somebody walking in off the street. But with animation, you might have, 50%, 70% freelance scripts in a given show. Not always, but sometimes. And so what would a freelance writer need to be able to pitch? To say for instance, Max and Ruby. Let's take that as an example.
Max and Ruby, 9 stories, gem. It's been an extremely popular show going on their 5th season now. An animated show just doesn't go 5 seasons unless it's extremely popular. Mm-hmm. And it's funny with a show like that. It's, in my experience, it's been, because I was new to that show when I wrote on it. I didn't write on its first 4 seasons. I wrote on its 5th season. And part of it is I've had met the story editor before, and she knew my love of the show because I had a 2-year-old at the time who liked watching it. It just seemed good timing to potentially be able to write on this. But new writers have broken in on that show specifically, I can say, from a knowing who's written on it. But it seems kind of strange. Like, it's in a blunt sort of terms, it's the reason why new writers, at least with animation, don't necessarily break in that easily, at least when a show starts, is because writers like to hire, they like to hire their friends, of course, right? Because it's, hey, we like working together and stuff like that. But the harsh reality is that writers who are known, who are experienced, are known quantities, right? So when they hire someone, they say, yeah, I worked with that person before, and yeah, sometimes they deliver good stuff, sometimes it's iffy, but at least we know we're not going to get anything that's completely off the wall that we don't know what it is, right? Which isn't true. Like, sometimes writers just don't get a show. I've not gotten shows many times where it's just, there's just the odd time you don't quite crack the sensibility, whatever it is. You're not quite in the headspace of that show enough. So it happens to even really experienced writers. But because of that, a lot of new writers are sort of hobbled right from the start in terms of this show starts up, right? A new show, whatever it is. And they want to hire the most experienced, the most professional, the most, like, the longest CVs you've ever seen. That's who they want to hire. Generally, what happens is that as a show progresses, the more they have a need for writers, the more they're willing to consider new writers, because it's out of necessity, right? It's like they're not getting enough scripts filled. A guy who's a friend of mine actually now, but I wasn't, I didn't get him these jobs because I wasn't the head writer on these shows, but I knew from personal experience his first 2 writing credits were on shows that needed stories. They desperately needed stories because they just got to the point where they were really having trouble getting stories approved. And whether it was the writers not getting it, or a lot of times it's producers just being very, very specific and picky about what they want. And if they're not getting it, then it grinds the whole schedule to a halt. And that's kind of that's where you start getting into freaking out territory, right? It's like it's a pipeline. It constantly has to be filled, right? It's got to be X number of new scripts every week. So when it starts reaching that point, that's sort of a sweet spot for, like, okay, what do you got? Like, who and if there's any way to actually be able to time this stuff for new writers, there'd be a lot more new writers working, because when a show gets to that point, it's like, who do we have? Like, I just need story ideas, whoever can come in and pitch. And then that's what will happen, is that somebody might break in and they pitch a bunch of stuff, and it might be rougher around the edges because they're new to that show or new to animation writing or whatever. But if it's a story they like, head writers know they can work with them. It's like, I care about the story. That's like filling the schedule slot. And so they may have to do more rewriting or more note giving or more mentoring, guiding this new writer. But the prime importance is to fill that slot and get an approved story. And, as a head writer on a couple of shows, I got to the point, where I was entertaining almost anything. Like I couldn't get stories approved myself, and the other story editor couldn't get stuff approved. And we had this intern in our office working for a period of time, which is kind of that's another whole story in itself. But she was a really hard worker and stuff like that. She was still in university. And it got to the point where I was asking her, it's like, you want to read this and see this show and see if you've got any ideas? Because you're hitting your head against the wall, right? And you just need to get stuff approved. And she didn't get anything approved, unfortunately, at that point. But that was the opportunity, She's actually gone on to write on a whole bunch of other stuff. So it's worked out pretty well. But that's the tricky thing, It's like my friend who got into this other thing, he just happened to time it just perfectly, and he was an established writer in his own right. He had written his own podcast and done all these other things. So he had some experience, and he just managed to find the right opportunity. But finding that opportunity is just hard. You never know when a show is going to really need somebody. It takes a really open-minded production to accept new writers right from the start. It's kind of fishing around to when a show's in the middle. They're not too close to the end because then they've got all their stories approved. They're not too close to the beginning. They're too picky about who they hire, I guess.
Yeah. Well. So let's take that as an example. So say Max and Ruby has gotten to the point where nobody can get any stories approved, and you're desperate for writers. And then you've got Joe Blow, who's on the street, who wants to be a writer. How does he find out about that opportunity? What does he need to be able to get into the room to pitch? Does he need an agent, or does he need a spec script, or what? How would you bridge that gap?
You know what? I should say that my friend who got on that show, who wrote on Max and Ruby as his first produced credit, did have an agent, but it was his first produced credit. So he got his agent through some really good specs that he had written, one of which won some online script contest. I think it was a Canadian script contest rather than a U.S. one, but he won like for a spec he'd written for this Canadian show called Corner Gas, which was a huge success up here. And that got him an agent along with some of his other writing. So it actually, I think it's really encouraging in a way, because it's like, it means that you don't, a lot of times some agents won't represent you unless you have a credit, right, or produced script, which almost defeats the purpose of having an agent in some ways, right? But, this writer took a chance on him and say, okay, you don't have any produced credits, but I like your stuff, and so that agent was who got him in, in terms of knowing cross-section of what was going on in the market at this point. It's like, okay, well, here's Nine Stories doing another season of Rex and Ruby. Let's call him and find out what's going on.
Now that's one way, but I've heard you don't necessarily need an agent. So if you didn't have an agent, what was a way that you could, number one, hear about that opportunity, and number two, actually get into pitch?
Well, hearing about the opportunity is 90% of it. Right. How do you have any idea what's going on with a show? Half the time I don't know what's going on. I have to find my agent to say, what's this company doing? What's that company doing? Because there's no way you can get a whole cross section of the industry. And even agents sometimes aren't aware of what's going on. So that really is the $1 million question. Writers hate to find out that it's like, well, it's networking who you know, but really it is in some ways of not who you know, but like knowing, just having your finger to the pulse of the industry, right? So reading about deals, like it's what productions are selling. You hear about stuff like MIPCOM's going on right now, right? It's like reading press releases is a huge thing, I think, in terms of finding out. It's like, well, this company is partnering with this company overseas to produce X, right? And what is X? Has it already been greenlit? Is it about to be greenlit? Like it involves doing a lot of research, because if you don't have an agent, you're doing the work of an agent in terms of finding out who's doing what. The agent is good because the agent can open the door for you if you don't know anybody, right? Because it's really, somebody has to get that script to somebody, or your sample to get in there and or at least get to the story editor just to let them send you some pitches. And that's a hard thing to do. So it's I wish I had a magic formula that I could give out, but the more you know about the industry that you're getting into, that you want to pitch to, the more informed you are, the more you're ready to strike when the iron's hot, right? When it's weird because I know with live action, obviously you can go and meet people, right? If you go on socially and work on sets, and anywhere you can get in to meet writers, right, is always a good thing. It never hurts, right? So then you get that perfect opportunity at some point, you can get somebody your script, you know?
Well, and certainly, networking with animation writers, I'm sure would be a big one if you can. And also, your example is getting a job at an animation company, whether you're the receptionist or the night janitor or whatever. I'm sure that would be a great place to start anyway, or at least for the shows at that particular animation company.
I'm gonna throw out another idea, which I think actually has a lot of validity in terms of how to get in with animation in terms of the industry. Is that in my experience, I haven't sold a show yet, right? My own creation of a show. I've worked on stuff that's been optioned, and there's some stuff in development a little bit that might happen, but from my experience as a writer doing development on shows that production companies have optioned, is the shows and some of the ideas they've optioned have been from complete, like, people who are new to the industry. So I think it's really encouraging, because it's one of these things where it's like, there's something about development people that, yeah, they always love to look at seasoned writers' stuff, right? Or production companies or artists. Like, that's the thing. If you're an artist, if you have any artistic inclination, you're already ahead of the game. Because it's animation, right? Animation isn't just about the writing, it's about the visuals. Like, I could have the best animation script, and you've got the worst artist working on it, your show is going to be a complete failure. So I've worked on development on some shows where they had a piece of art. A production company has literally optioned a piece of art almost, because it was just such a cool thing.
Wow.
And it's like, there's sort of an idea maybe behind it, but it's not a show, right? So what do? It happens a lot. Like, if it's a short story or a kid's book, right? Like in preschool especially, it's like, there's this lovely preschool kid's book, right? And it has gorgeous images and just a sweet little story that's probably 5 sentences long. How do you make a show out of something that's 5 sentences, right? You need a writer to do that. So, if you really artistically and animationally did I just make up a word, animationally? Then, coming up with your own show idea, especially when it's like loaded with art and some kind of your own designs and stuff like that, if it can get the intention of a production company, that's a definite in. It can be harder to even write on your own show if they option it, because you might not have a track record, which is why I think you would need a spec script or something, or a script with it, to like be able to show, okay, I've got this great idea, here's the pretty art that you've optioned it, and here's the script that goes with it, right? And if you can write on the show as well, if you've proven that you can write these animated scripts, it's like the double barrel, right? You've blasted your way in, and if the show actually gets greenlit, you're going to be attached somehow, if not as a head writer, then at least as a contributing writer, rather than just someone they option it from and then push you out of the picture, right? Which happens too. Like, if, that's why you have to sort of be, the more experienced you are in the scripting process, I think the better your chances are of staying through the entire process.
And this is a total tangent, total aside, but I did want to remind everybody that Dave was on the TV Writer Chat a few weeks ago. And if you go to tvwriterchat.com, you can look through the older transcripts, and I definitely recommend that you do go through that transcript if you want to know more about this. There are things that we covered in that chat that we won't necessarily cover here. And there was also animation writer Stephen Darren-Sett as a guest on that chat. So do check that out, and you will find a lot more. In specific, Dave and Stephen talked about the bigger budget primetime shows like Family Guy and how they're approached differently. And there was some discussion about Canadian versus American writing. There was also some discussion about pitching ideas and that kind of thing. So definitely check that out. And also, while I mentioned that, I should also make sure you follow Dave on Twitter. @DSDave is your Twitter handle.
Yeah, I'm pretty new to Twitter as a whole, so I haven't posted a whole lot of stuff, but I'm hoping on being able to post a little more in the future. I don't know. Animation is just a really interesting side of the business that maybe not that many people know about, but it can be pretty robust at times. So it's definitely, if you have any interest, in animation, it's definitely good to look into.
Yeah. Now, speaking about robust, this might be a loose segue. In scripted, you start at a certain level, you make a certain amount, and within a couple of years, you could be doubling that amount. And within another couple of years, you could be doubling that amount. And within, there are 30-year-olds, not a lot of them, but there are 30-year-olds making $1 million a year. Animation, there's money in it, but it's approached totally differently. Tell me about that.
Oh, okay. You know what? My Canadian experience might be vastly different from the American experience with animation, because the animation in the States literally is not covered by the Guild at all. And in Canada, it is. It's just there's less that's covered by the Guild.
Oh, I see.
So things like productions becoming signatory to the Writers Guild in Canada is there, but there's no script fee minimum. It's something that we're trying to work on because it's been a long time coming. But yeah, the script fees are lower in animation, even in stable animation marketplaces, it's lower. And where that comes from, again, I don't know the entire history. I just know that the rates haven't gone up in in the 13 years I've been doing it. So a lot of times for experienced writers, it becomes about volume. It's like, how many scripts can I write? And I'm sure for all of us, it can get to the point where it's like, you don't want to say no to things, but if too many things start popping up, you literally have to start saying, I can't possibly do all of this, or I'm going to start handing in some subpar work. But in terms of like for head writers and like story editors and creative producers and stuff like that, when you're like the head writer, on a show, those rates are more negotiable. Like there's sort of unwritten minimums for other series, like as a freelancer, right? But as a head writer, the fee scale varies widely, and it all depends on what you can negotiate. You know what I mean? Like it's what's your rate, how successful was your last show, that kind of thing. And it can go up from there to very large amounts depending on what the production is, the show. But for the average, animation writer who's sort of making a living out there, like it can be lucrative, but it's not like the same as live action, at least in the States for sure, where it's like, you're right, you get a 30-year-old making $1 million, or even entry level writers are still making like $250,000, I think, right? Like you're starting up in that sort of ballpark. So, and that's often just to be in the room, You're not even guaranteed scripts, like which pay, on top of that. But they value the room. The room is where all the magic happens. And then you get the head writers filtering out with the scripting process. With animation, it just doesn't exist that way. It's like there's less budget for writers and less budget per script. So I can't speak for writers because I've never worked in the big live action venue. So I know that it pays less, but it still pays fairly decently, at least, if you can write enough. From a freelance perspective, if you're just writing one or two, it's not going to change your life financially. But it's interesting. You work on a show that's a big enough profile show, and it can get you other shows, definitely. And you know what? If you create a show, if you get to that point where you're the head writer and you're creating a show, it does start changing your life financially. Maybe not like $250,000 or $500,000 financially, but if you start having a royalty stake in a show you've created, it can mean a lot, down the road. And whatever you negotiate, if you're a head writer and you negotiate your one show and it becomes a hit, or you do really well on it, then your next show, obviously, you'll probably make more, and it goes from there. But it just gets tough because there are productions out there, because there's no minimums, that, you get offered something or a show comes in and it's like less than what you've made 13 years ago on a show.
Wow.
In terms of per script. And so you're like, wow, is this really what it is? And the reality is a lot of production companies, animation is generally cheaper to do. So it means that there's more people that are doing it. You know what I mean? Because they can. I can now afford as a producer to make this show. But a lot of times if they start cutting like the writing budget back and shaving it back, it gets tricky. Like, who are you going to hire on it? It becomes a question of, is you're probably going to hire more new writers, because more experienced writers are going to go work on things that maybe pay better.
And to be clear, we're not really talking about the primetime shows like Family Guy or Seinfeld. Those really are, as far as I understand, approached just like sitcom writing. As a matter of fact, if you were to just walk in the room, it would look like a sitcom staff. I
would think so. Yeah, they do. In fact, are some of those actually covered by the Guild?
I'm pretty sure they are. I'm pretty sure the primetime animation in that category is run just like sitcom writing, which would mean that you'd have to have a great sitcom spec to get in. And all the rules of sitcom writing would apply to that. But we're sort of not talking about that sphere right now. And as you describe that process of what you negotiate, obviously that's where your agent is going to be very important. So it might be a good opportunity to talk about, you've been with Jennifer Hollier. And you've been with her all along?
No, I've been with her for about 3 years now. I was with another agent who left the business.
Oh, okay.
at 35 or whatever it was. It wasn't for him. He just wanted to become a teacher, and he left. So it gave me a chance to shop around, and Jenny was great, and she's been fantastic. But it does help. It does, even though I have a lot of animation contacts that I've worked at a lot of different companies and stuff like that, but I still find it's fantastic to have an agent if it's, because there's aspects of deals that, because there's no Writers Guild, like there's some Writers Guild stuff that's covered, but because there's no minimums and stuff, you have the potential of getting gouged if you're not careful and you don't know what kind of language you're looking at in your contracts. And just knowing what the lay of the land is in terms of like being able to negotiate that kind of thing, it's definitely a good idea. But the other aspect I was going to mention when it comes to fees being lower, I guess the silver lining of like a show that has a smaller script fee is that there is potentially an opportunity for newer writers to get jobs on that because, you know, other experienced writers, if they say no and they pass it, somebody has to write that stuff, right?
And less of a risk.
Yeah, that's a risk. Yeah, but ultimately, usually what happens is that an experienced writer will probably just cut their rate a little bit, especially if they're offered a deal where they get to write a bulk of episodes, right? And maybe 10 or something like that. It's like, okay, well, you make like $1,000 less per script, but you get like 10 of them instead. So who in their right mind would say no to that if it's something that they want to do or that they could use the money for, right? So, but it would just be better as a whole if there was minimums, then you wouldn't get into those kind of like situations. It can be awkward or difficult. But again, animation is just it's you know, I love writing in it, but oftentimes in the production world, it is treated as like regular, you know, daytime animation, kids animation, stuff like that is treated like a second-class citizen in the writing world. And it's a shame because there's some really clever writers working out there doing some pretty amazing stuff because you have to be, the really good stuff is highly imaginative. Like, you know, you can go out there, way out there if you really want to take it there. And it has to be funny and visual in a way that sitcoms can never be because they just can't go to certain places. So, you know, it really deserves more respect in that regard, but I'm biased.
Yeah. Now let's talk a little bit more about people breaking in, but also people pitching and somebody who might have their own ideas for stuff. You've said that you said on the TV Writer Chat that it can be hard to get sample scripts, especially the children's shows. So how would somebody learn the format to even be able to have a decent spec?
That's a really good question, Greg, because it's not being able to find samples out there makes it really difficult. I was kind of surprised by what animation scripts looked like when I first saw them because they were just buried in the back of these binders at the animation company working with, you know, there's a storyboard and there's some scripts, right? And the scripts just look denser than I was used to seeing for feature scripts. So it's like, why is that? What is that? And now it's like the closest thing you can often get to finding an animated script online is like a Simpsons or a Family Guy out there, you know, South Park, I think you can find out there. But a regular, like, can you find a Dora the Explorer script? You know, can you find a Phineas and Ferb script out there? I don't know. But they're just as crucial to find because, you know, especially something like a Phineas and Ferb, like it's like animation companies all want like a big gigantic hit like that, right? And I guess it's cyclical. It's just like every few years. It's like a few years ago would be we want a SpongeBob SquarePants, right? Now that show's gone on forever. It makes even more money. But right now it's like Phineas and Ferb is a gigantic property for Disney, and every animation company wants to have something a lot like it. So it'd be great to actually have a sample of one of those scripts to see what it looks like. But in lieu of that, you just have to look at the show. It's really just involved with really watching the show and realizing that a lot of kids shows have a very distinct formula to them. And formula is a loaded term because formula, you know, in terms of the adult writing world, you think of formula as predictable, boring, juvenile, whatever, right? But formula just means it's like the template for the show. It's you know, Law and Order template is you start with that guy's voice, you know, going da 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 dung dung, and like every time you cut away, you've got a little text saying where you are, what the date is, and time and stuff like that. That's part of that show's template and structure. And animated shows are no different. So, and the more kid-like it is, especially the younger you go down, the more of a template it is. And in fact, stuff like reuse. You know, you watch Dora the Explorer, right? Like I keep bringing that show up because it's a gigantic monster hit. That's like $1 billion industry for Nickelodeon. You know, you watch that show and it's like there's always segments when they're singing and traveling. You know, her backpack song, it's like it's in every single episode. So it has to be there. It's going to be there in your script. You have to account for that in your script length. You can't go too long because, oh, well, there's this song, this song, this song we always have to have. Young kids like repetition, right? So it's not there just for being cheap. It helps when you have to regular template segments that you have to show all the time. But kids, it's there because kids like it as well. So the older you get, the more the template is going to be different or unique or whatever it is. And having that script, it was crucial to see. But if you can't see it, then at least you have to watch that show and know intimately what makes that structure unique to that show. So I'm convinced that if you watch a show enough, you can pretty much mimic what that structure is. You may not know the exact wording of how it wouldn't look identical to a sample script, but if you watch a million hours of Dora, you could pretty much write a script and wing it to know what structure points to put in and stuff, so that somebody would read it and say, wow, this person knows that show intimately. Even though they never saw what the actual script looked like, it would be pretty darn close, right? So yeah, so I wouldn't suggest that anybody get upset or downtrodden by not being able to find more like Saturday morning or Cartoon Network type scripts out there. You just watch a show enough and you know how to write a normal script. Just write it that way with that show's leanings in mind.
Cool. Yeah, great advice. And so let's talk about a little bit about pitching shows. Something that you mentioned. There was a long discussion on the TV Writer Chat about how when you pitch a show, you've got to have art. What does that art look like? And people talked about, do you need to know how to draw? And you made a point that bad art is not going to sell your show.
Yeah, it's not. That's very, very true. It's funny because I've actually just started teaching a class in animation writing. It's just a local college up here. It's just a night course for adults. And I'm filling in for someone that had to drop out at the last minute. So it's only 12 weeks, but it's all about Bible writing and pilot script writing. And so I came across the same issue where I'm talking about saying, do you put art or not? Because I'm literally looking at samples of stuff, and it's like almost every Bible I've got for a show has some kind of art in it. And if it doesn't have art in it, it's usually because it's a writer's Bible. So the show's already been sold, and now it's just information for writers, right, to know. So the reality is that if you've got art in it, it's going to sell much, much easier than it would if it didn't. Like, your writing skills have to be incredible to write a non-art package and still get sold. And it does happen. And if the idea is good enough and it's written clearly and succinctly enough, it can still sell. Just your odds, you're helping your odds better by having some kind of art. But bad art is like, it's hard to say, because if you're not an animator, what constitutes bad art? And all you can do is go with your own gut instincts. And you can look at a few different aspects of it, right? Where there's somebody's quote about The Simpsons, right? Is that if you look at The Simpsons characters in silhouette, you know immediately who they are, right? Because they're that well designed as characters. So immediately, Bart is Bart because of his spiky hairdo, right? Homer's Homer because he's got the 3 hairs on his bald head and he's got the big paunch. Marge, of course, her hair is going to give her away easily. So cartoon characters need to be that stark and identifiable as characters, and not just as themselves, but in context with the show, with everybody else, and the more visual it is, the better. If it's a really cartoony show, it's got to be way out there in terms of the art. So it's another thing that I guess you really have to know your animated shows, or at least do some research to say, well, what's the style? Like, what style would best suit this? It's not just enough to draw some pretty images. It's like, do you want King of the Hill type art, which is almost like very realistic? That's about one of the most realistic cartoons out there, right? Everybody kind of look like real people, or do you want to go out there and you're going to make Aqua Teen Hunger Force, where the main characters are like fries and a shake and a meatball, right? It's like whatever they are. It's just that and how crazy looking are they going to be? So I'm going off on a tangent with this stuff, but you can't just throw in any art and expect it to be good. You really need I would get some kind of opinion from an artist or somebody maybe that works in TV, or just something to look at and say, wow, is this, because amateur drawings are good. I saw a Bible for a show that I actually wouldn't have minded working on in terms of development. And it was a company that was looking for a development deal. And they had a seed of a decent show, but the art that they had attached to it was just subpar. And it was just like, it was like somebody had drawn some stuff and it was kind of cute and sweet, but it was just like, you could just tell it just didn't look professional. And that's the one thing. Good art can help you sell it, but bad art, well, as I said, will just, sink it. So I said, this show is better without that art.
And you mentioned a great idea on the chat about hiring an artist, making them an equal co-creator. Tell me about that.
Well, I haven't done this myself, but I know of other writers who have done that, because it's, we often find ourselves in the same position. We've worked really, really hard over X number of months or years even potentially on an idea, and we want to make sure we sell this thing, right? And sometimes we haven't, and you're like, wow, I guess I really need to get some art attached to this. So what do you do, And at least one writer friend of mine has said, look, I need art. I can't draw with anything, and I can't afford money up front. It's a big investment to pay somebody up front to put art on something that may result in no sale for you. If you've got a lot of cash sitting around, then why not? Like you could probably get some good art for a few $100s from somebody, right? But again, it's like artists need to be treated with respect too, right? So it's like you can't just throw $50 at a guy and expect to get tons and tons of art from someone and be able to exploit it in perpetuity forever. That's why I think it's like if the art is as important towards getting your idea sold, then my friend's ideas, I make them a partner, created by myself and artist, right? Because a created by credit is a created by credit, right? Like you could be involved with the show later. You may just be, that's where it ends, right? And you'll see royalty checks if the thing gets made, like episodes, however many episodes they make, you get an X number of royalty dollars and they get sent to you. So, if you're a script writer and you created it, like the text and stuff like that, there might be a better chance of you staying with the show later on. But the artist I would think, be pretty happy to say, look, especially if they're not an experienced animation artist, like real animation artists want to be with the show. It's their creation, right? Mm-hmm. But if they're not with a company already, or if it's sold to another company, like it just may not be possible for them to stay on through the whole thing. It starts getting into legal areas that are kind of gray, right? So, it's best if you get a lawyer or something to get like a contract with an artist too, because you just don't want to. I guess you can have a handshake agreement, but I wouldn't suggest it.
Good point.
I haven't hired an artist myself, but I just think it's like, if you're going to create a show with somebody, do all writers have contracts with each other to say, we're going to split this 50-50 no matter what? They probably should, but how often do they? I don't know. So it's probably the same thing with an artist, right? It's like it could be a gentleman's agreement or just like a little document that you sign between yourselves. Like, I don't know. I would probably hire a lawyer every time. But again, how badly do you want to sell your idea? How badly do you want to get art attached to it? I'm sure there's a lot of artists that would love the chance to say, look, I'm creating something on spec here for somebody, but they're doing it on spec too. Like, we're going in as partners to try and sell this thing. And they can, at the very least, they can add it to their portfolio,
Cool. Well, actually, we're getting close to the end here. And I'm sorry, we haven't really talked a lot about in particular, the shows that you've worked on, but I thought it was a great opportunity to just talk about generalities of the industry. And Are there any shows that you feel like would be helpful to bring up? I know you worked on Doodlebops, you worked on Franklin, Caillou, Max and Ruby.
Those are the preschool kids shows. I mean, the thing about preschool is that there's a lot of work as a whole, because most networks have a preschool block of some kind, right? Not all networks have a teen block, or an adult block. Whatever. But so there's just generally more of those kind of shows going on, and they're incredibly hard to write for. So if anyone out there thinks that preschool kids show, it'll be a cakewalk, there's a lot more restrictions to them. They can be very, very difficult. But at the same time, they can often be the most evergreen. That's a phrase I've heard many times in terms of a show being like they can sell it and show it in multiple markets around the world for decades, and you can't tell. Like it's the original Care Bears, I think, is still being shown in various places. They've done more versions, but the property as a whole just keeps going on and on and on, And even stuff like Franklin, like they're doing another season, it's just 3D, and same with Babar and all these old shows. But as an adult, to me, I love to do older stuff too. Like the boys action adventure stuff seems to be my leaning. Like I don't know, because I think of myself as an 8-year-old kid watching all this great stuff, and you're creating it, right? It's like, what's the coolest? I have said this a couple times when I'm writing on a boys action adventure show. It's like, what's the coolest thing I could see right now happening?
Uh-huh.
And you concoct it, right? As long as it makes a logical sense that it happens, it's just out of the blue. It's like, wow. And then you see it animated. You're just like, that's awesome. It's like your 8-year-old has jumped into an adult's body and made this thing happen as an artist, which I just love.
Yeah.
But boys action adventure is kind of like in the bit of a doldrums right now in terms of like popularity of genres. Like I've worked on a show called Redakai, which is on Cartoon Network, and it's a big deal in terms of like a property. It's like all these creature shows and stuff like that, like or Beyblade or any of these anime shows. It's like it's sort of staking out that market where there's a whole toy line that's attached to these cards and stuff like that. But it has some pretty cool stuff in the show in terms of like battles and explosions and all this kind of stuff. So it's like it's appropriate for that age group. I wouldn't show younger kids it, but man, thrilling, visceral action stuff is like, I love it.
Yeah. Well, and that brings up another point that you did mention in the chat as well. It should go without saying that if you want to write for animation, that you got to watch a lot of it.
Yeah, you know what? It really does. It's like what I've sort of learned, not just with animation, just it's pretty much any kind of writing is like, if you don't have your heart completely in it, it shows up on the page, right? It's a cliche, but I think with animation, it might happen even more frequently because a lot of people do look down on it. It's like, oh, it's animation, it's for cartoons, it's for kids. Kids are idiots. They're not going to know what they're watching here, and they don't give it the full respect it deserves, and it shows up in your writing. And the people that work in animation take it very, very seriously. They want to see quality put behind this stuff, even if it's a very insular universe that the show is. It has to be the best examples of that universe that you can put on paper. So, I mean, you got to know it inside and out. You can't just watch one episode of something and think you got to really, really get into it. I think a lot of people, especially in preschool, can be tough to get into it as adults because you just don't watch a lot of it unless you have kids. But if you're a professional, you sit down, you watch it, you learn what it is that you love about that show, and you have to write to that. Working at Nelvana in some ways was the best thing that ever happened because I worked on a bunch of shows that I loved, and I worked on some shows that I really did not love. But yet I had to make a quota for a certain number of scripts for the year. I had to write on some shows. That's all they had going on that month. So it's like, how do I come up with something for a show that I may not necessarily want to watch? And you find the aspect of it that you love and you write to that. And then when you see the finished product, you're like, wow, I transcended something that I, on first glance, might not have liked and turned it into something that I wanted to watch. And that, to me, is the mark of a professional writer in almost any genre.
Well, I think that actually is a wonderful place to end up. I think that's probably a great lesson for any staff writer, scripted animation or not. We're all going to be in a situation like that if we want to get into the industry where we get a job on something it's not necessarily our dream show, and so very, very good advice. Write to what you do love about that show. Yeah. But is there anything before we wrap up that you would want to talk about in general? No, it's just it's animation is kind of changing as a market. It's there's so much of it out there, and there's a lot of preponderance of young kids, like live action tween shows on U.S. networks and Canadian networks, that animation's kind of dropped off a little bit in terms of the amount of productions going on. But some of the stuff they're doing is really fascinating, like some hybrid productions, I'm developing a show with a company called Marble Media right now for CBC, and I think they're selling a MIP right now, but a preschool kids show called Chugga Chugga Wow, and it's all about kids. It's animation, but it has live action kids in it, right? So it's that kind of thing. You have the reality of real kids acting like real kids, but you've got the fantastical aspect of animation to put it in, and it's pretty amazing. They're doing just some incredible stuff with animation. It's almost like the reverse of motion capture, right? It's just like you're putting real kids, you keep them as real kids, but you put them in this cartoon universe, and you get to see some pretty amazing, fun stuff. So as a genre, it's going to some pretty exciting places. Very, very cool. And so reminder again, you can follow Dave on Twitter at DSDave. And I want to thank you so much for being with us. And best of luck to you in all of your animated stuff. Thank you, Greg. Thanks for having me on. Cool. Okay, thanks, Dave. Hosted by Gray Jones, the TV Writer Podcast is brought to you by Script Magazine and ScriptMag.com, the leading source for script writing information in print and on the web. And by Final Draft script writing software, the entertainment industry standard for script writing worldwide.